Welcome to this second part of my interview with Dr. Subbarao. I'm sure all of you watched the first part and were eagerly waiting for the part two. So, without any ado, let's dive into the interview. One more thing I must, I don't know whether it was consciously or unconsciously. I used to know Dr. Reddy quite well as well. Sorry, Mr. Reddy.
Master
And
communicator.
But what was different during his time was a lot of the comments were made on the sidelines. So
On
the
the
communication on the sidelines. So
right.
so it was not very structured. What
Yeah.
I found in the course of our interactions that your communication was far more structured. So we had, for instance, far more meetings with yourself and your deputies, the DGs and EDs, as
Yeah.
market representatives than we used to have before or after. That much I can tell you. In fact, later on they were completely cut out. That was one. The other thing is, in those meetings, I rarely found you personally commenting on topics which were not yours. For instance, Subir Gokarna would always talk about, if there was a question relating to monetary policy, he would talk about it. Or Mr. Khan was there, or Shamla Gopinath was there. Right? So on FX matters, uh, clearing systems, etc. So I think that was for me a big change, and I think it was positive because we also found, as market players, a lot of the input, it was a two-way communication. So a lot of stuff that was told to you found its way either in policy, or it was told to us clearly as to, why this can't be done or whatever. So there was more transparency as well, rather than, I am central banker, I am governor, I'm going to be inscrutable, something like that. So was that also conscious? Did you notice that?
Well, that is your comment. I didn't consciously notice it, but I believe that RBI should be more open, should be listening to the markets and market participants, listening to all stakeholders, in fact, even to ordinary people. And we may not always respond. We might be in a listening mode, but listening to market participants gives us information, knowledge, and even wisdom. So it was important, and I believed in that, and I encouraged the senior management to do that as well. Because as I told you, everything that the RBI does is ultimately boils down to managing expectations. And what are the expectations of markets is important for us to know. And speaking to market participants is also a way of managing
Of
expectations.
course, of
So I
course.
believed in that.
Uh, I would relate to you a very, maybe a minor incident from your point of view, but Clearing Corporation had started a clearing platform for FX. You might recollect during your tenure. And Shamla Gopinath was actually very keen to get it popularized, and no one was using it. And we had a conversation, and actually it was a one-on-one, and very interestingly, it was very simple to understand. They were taking a 3-day worst case loss situation and working out margins based on that. So that is what we would have to contribute. So we had the conversation. It suggested that should be cut down. The next day, I got a call from CCIL saying, "What should it be?" I said, "It should be logically 1.5 days or something. Anyway, you're going to." And
Yeah,
believe me, in a week, this was implemented. So
right.
I don't know whether it ever came up to you or not, but I do feel that there was some level of, receptivity and empowerment, which is
Thank you
also
for
in a
saying that.
way different from. So on the policy side specifically, would you like to comment a little bit on how monetary policy worked when you were at the helm? Uh, Most of the time, Subir was DG, right? If I'm not mistaken. And
Yeah, Rakesh was there for the first 1 year and
yes,
Urjit
yes.
Patel for the last 6 months. So for about 3.5 years, Subir was the deputy governor in charge of monetary policy. Yeah.
And there was a lot of discussion, things like that. You did have engagement with market, I know, but
Oh,
apart from that, how did?
absolutely. There was a lot of concern about why inflation was so stubborn and persistent and why it was not coming down. And the markets were criticizing it, not the markets, but generally the media, commentators, analysts were criticizing us for not tightening rapidly enough. And in fact, the book I wrote, which you referred to, I explained why we did not tighten soon enough. First, we were wrong footed by the data because the data was showing that growth was in fact lower than what it turned out to be later. So we were worried about growth. And second, there was the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis going on. And you recall at that time, most people don't connect our action or inaction with what happened in Eurozone. The ECB actually raised interest rate from the GFC low rates, and they had to, claw back. So they're wrong-footed and claw back. So and there was a lot of uncertainty because of the Eurozone crisis still in the
Right.
markets. So we had to be more careful. And it cannot be two steps forward and one step back. So people who criticize us in an absolute sense without going back to the circumstances in which we acted.
Yeah.
Not that I'm offering a defense, but I just thought that I should remind people about looking at the circumstances in which we acted.
If I may move to what, maybe juicy is the wrong word, but some part of juicy kind of part from your book, which related to your, if I may use the word again, tiffs with Ministry of Finance. And I mean, I don't know. It's of course documented history that even as far as the 2G scam you know inquiry was concerned, the court has commended you on what you brought out and what you held. So
Right.
these are all positives, but would like to hear in your own words your North Block versus Mint Street, particularly having come from North Block.
No, I would have answered this question more comfortably maybe 1 year ago before Trump came on the scene. But, Trump is running a tirade against the Federal Reserve virtually every day, with the result that in political discourse has become acceptable to criticize the bank or saying that the central bank does not believe in growth and stability, etc. But coming back to our own situation and my own tenure, it is true that I had differences with the Ministry of Finance. In fact, like you said, having come from the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Chidambaram used to tell me that he told me when I was governor, when I went to see him, that all of you who go from Ministry of Finance, North Block to Mint Street, you become hostage to the technocracy of the RBI. He told me openly, and I said this as well. Uh, but to understand this question in context, why are there differences, not just in India but across the world, in most countries between the government and the central bank? Is because uh, the central bank is enjoined with the responsibility of maintaining price stability and financial stability. That requires it to take some difficult decisions by taking a long-term view, decisions that might cause pain in the short term. Though you cannot leave such painful decisions to the elected politicians because they have a short term electoral cycle. Their horizons are short. They look to the next election. They won't do this thing. In fact, if you give them charge of the printing press, they'll print currency and debase the money. So that is the rationale for having a central bank at arm's length from the government, managed by technocrats with a clear mandate. Uh, they have, if they don't have a mandate independence, but they have instrument independence, how to deliver on that mandate. And the tension arises because governments are driven by short term compulsions. The central bank is mandated to take a long term view. And that came to a sharp focus during my time because inflation was stubbornly high. So the RBI was required to tighten policy and keep a tight policy for much longer than politicians liked. But at the same time, you remember UPA 2, there was concerns about growth slumping and policy paralysis. So there was a lot of political dependence on the RBI to do something, just to give the impression of doing something. So both Chidambaram and Pranab Mukherjee were arguing or, stumping for lower rates, whereas the RBI believed that we must maintain a tight stance. And that brought us to uh, differences which sometimes opened up in the public.
But I think it's great that you could deal with it, and you dealt with it, because I can imagine it's not so easy, particularly after having emerged from the finance ministry, so to say, and having possibly had them as direct bosses prior to
Yeah.
Reserve Bank. So appreciate that. So the next question is about, and you have written about it in your recent article in the op-ed at the FT. Do you believe strongly that we are now in a India is now in a structurally different growth trajectory?
Yeah, that FT article was actually titled "Has India Shifted to a Higher Growth Trajectory Structurally?" Because that is one of the debates right now we're having in the economy today. Now, if you look around, you'll find that while the rest of the world is actually reeling under global political and economic uncertainty, India is showing tremendous, remarkable resilience. Growth is upwards of 7%, inflation is benign, external deficit is quite modest, bank and corporate balance sheets are healthy, healthier than they've been in years. So there is a tantalizing question of are we in a Goldilocks situation? Because this is quite in contrast to our historical record. Historically, we oscillated between two extremes. We had rapid expansion, but soon collided with domestic or external instability.
Right.
Or we had stability, but that came at the cost of modest growth. Today, are we in a situation of rapid growth and stability? Uh, they, yes, that is partly because of good structural economic management. We've had the inflation targeting framework, which has given transparency and predictability to monetary policy. Fiscal consolidation at the center and certainly at the center is more credible. We're less dependent on foreign resources, as evident from the low current account deficits. So there is a plausible case that we have shifted to a higher growth trajectory. But on the other side, there are equally weighted questions. For example, if you look at our growth record historically, we over the last 40 years, we clocked growth of 8+%, perhaps three times. And never could we sustain that growth for more than two consecutive years. So can we sustain this level of growth with stability? A more important and more weighty question is, what is this growth generating? If you look, there is, if you look beyond the numbers, you'll find that rapid growth is not generating jobs. Only about less than 25% is employed in the formal sector. Most of the labor force is in the informal sector with irregular, uncertain incomes. That is why consumption is not picking up. Consumption is actually tracking below headline GDP numbers. Because there is no consumption demand, there is no investment demand. Because there is no investment demand, we're not able to get onto a virtuous cycle of growth and stability. So we need to generate jobs. Where are jobs going to come from? Are they going to come from manufacturing? Manufacturing is, in fact, growing at a very slow percentage, might be at 12 or 13%, perhaps even lower. Exports, we need to jack them up further. So where is growth going to come from? Can we get onto a virtuous growth cycle? Still remains an open question. So to sum up, my answer is yes, it's quite plausible that we shifted to a structurally higher growth trajectory, but we cannot take that for granted yet.
Very true. Additionally, having leapfrogged the industrial growth stage, with 60% of our GDP now coming out of services sector, employment is going to be a challenge. So we shouldn't lose out on the
Right,
demographic dividend as we go forward.
right. Yeah.
So
In
that's
fact, you
interesting.
remember that once sometimes your textbooks tell us that economies move from primary agriculture to secondary
Yeah.
manufacturing to tertiary. We used to take pride in the fact that India leapfrogged over the secondary sector, went directly from agriculture to services. Now that's actually caught up with us. We now realize
True.
that we cannot accelerate and sustain a high growth rate
Yeah.
unless we jack up manufacturing.
Very true. Very true. And then, on the policy side, inflation targeting, which has been, most governors have been extremely fond of it. and not just in India but the world over. So
Right.
do you believe in it from your book? It's not. You are not a believer, that's for sure. And do you think what have been the results? Have they been what could be expected?
Yeah, not a believer is not a correct statement of the current situation because I cannot say I'm not a believer, but just to preface my answer with some historical record, inflation targeting became very popular starting in the 1990s. For 30 to 40 countries embarked on inflation targeting and produced remarkable record of stability, price stability, financial stability, and steady growth. So central bankers around the world thought that they discovered the holy grail to growth and stability. But that sense of triumph was dented by the global financial crisis. In fact, commentators, analysts now say that one of the main reasons for the GFC was the complacence of central bankers that they've solved the macroeconomic problem. In fact, they had not, because with their single-minded focus on price stability and inflation, they let a lot of cancer develop in the underneath. So, with the global financial crisis, inflation targeting lost some of its sheen. That was the time when I became governor. So, when I was questioned at that time whether we should embark on inflation targeting, I was quite skeptical about its credibility because that was the situation around the world. I
Right.
also had concerns or reservations because much of our inflation is driven by supply shocks. It is true
Very
then,
true.
it's true even today. It's because of food supply or oil supply, for which monetary policy cannot be the first line of defense.
Right.
I also had reservations because of administered interest rates and their impact on monetary policy transmission.
Right.
Those reservations prompted me to express concern about adopting inflation targeting in the early part of my tenure. But some of my reservations have worked down over time. We have less administered rates. We're less dependent. We still have supply shocks, but perhaps less prone to supply shocks. So inflation targeting is making its way. I believe it's given transparency and credibility to our monetary policy. So I would say that it is a moderate success, but still there are some caveats. For example, about exchange rate.
Right.
If there's an exchange rate crisis,
Yeah.
and would the RBI have the independence or autonomy to invoke monetary policy, as I did during taper tantrum that we
True.
talked about, to manage the exchange rate crisis, even if the inflation situation is saying that you do not need to tighten policy.
Right.
So whether RBI's degrees of freedom have been cut is a question that has not yet been tested.
Absolutely. Finally, we were in budget season, so uh, any comments? You've been busy as well, talking about it and writing possibly. Any comments on the budget? More could have been done on the fiscal consolidation side in your mind?
I don't think so. The finance minister has done significant fiscal consolidation over the last 5 years after COVID. Last this current year, fiscal year 26, is 4.4% of GDP. Next year is budgeted to be 4.3% of GDP. Any more aggressive consolidation would probably have hurt growth. So I have no quarrel with the headline fiscal deficit. She's also shifted the anchor from fiscal deficit to debt to GDP, which I believe is conceptually sound. So my reservations are more about the nitty gritty, the plumbing of how we achieve 4.3% or how we get to a lower debt to GDP ratio. I believe we have to do a lot of expenditure restructuring because revenue expenditure is still high. Revenue
Right.
deficit is still quite high. If your
Right.
revenue deficit is high, how do you get to a lower debt to GDP ratio? If interest payments and expenditure on current consumption, like expenditure on what we call freebies or transfer payments,
Yeah. Yeah.
they're going to take up a considerable part of your expenditure. How are you going to consolidate
True.
on the fisc? How are you going to get to a lower debt to GDP ratio? So my concern is more not so much about the headline numbers, but more about the engineering of expenditure compression.
which also brings us to the point about you mentioned freebies and state deficits, fiscal states versus federalism as you referred to
Right.
it. So you think that's very north-south kind of issue? You want to comment on how is it going to play out in the future?
Yeah, I can comment on it because I have written about it. Okay.
Of
But
course.
yeah, so let's see. Over the last 2 years, two South Indian chief ministers, Chandrababu Naidu of Andhra Pradesh and Stalin of Tamil Nadu, have urged their people to have more babies, to have more children. I never thought that in my lifetime I would see a chief minister telling his
From the
people
south.
or her people to actually have more children because we were brought up on family planning. We believe that we have a population problem. I personally believe that we still have a population problem. But I can understand where the southern chief ministers are coming from. But the message they're sending is that we are being penalized because we've been more effective at population control. If central resource transfers are going to be dependent on population, we're losing out. In fact, evidence shows that. For example, for every rupee that Karnataka or Tamil Nadu contributes to the central tax pool, they get back less than a rupee. For every rupee Bihar or Jharkhand contributes to the central tax pool, they get back more than a rupee. So there is some sort of a cross subsidization.
Yeah, yeah,
Some subsidization, cross subsidization is inevitable in every
yeah,
federation that happens. But the question now is whether we are actually going beyond acceptable limits. So that is a concern of southern chief ministers where this has opened up a north-south cleavage, and I believe that this needs to be addressed. The Finance Commission, whose report has been recently released, has gone some distance in essuaging this, but we still have a long way to go.
yeah. What I must say is that apart from what everybody knows, your should I say glittering career both in the ministry as well as at RBI, what facet has come out for me at least is a lot of scholarly,
I know,
kind of bent of mind in our discussion today. So I urge people that they must read your books because I did,
I know. Thank
and
you very
they
much.
will find it. They will find it very interesting. I will put out links to the books when we put out the post on this interview.
Sure.
We've discussed quite a lot. I've taken a lot of your time, but I have found it very, very, very interesting and educative. I'm sure all our viewers will as well. And thank you very much again for coming onto the show and really making our day. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you, Manoj, for those insightful questions and for the interview. Thanks very much. Bye.